This week I have a story for you about a man who gradually loses the ability to see, but when a strange new virus strikes the earth, it turns out that not being able to see is not only a curse, but also a kind of blessing. I wasn't born sightless. For the first 10 years of my life, I could see perfectly well. Then I began to experience problems with my vision. After many tests, the doctor said I had retinitis pigmentosa caused by a faulty gene, and they informed my parents that I would, in all likelihood, soon become completely blind. There was nothing they could do, and they advised my parents to prepare me as best they could for a life of blindness. My parents were well off and had many useful contacts. My mother was a violinist who had played in the London Symphony Orchestra, and my father a pianist of some renown. They began to make arrangements to send me to a special school, and they took me several times a week to a teacher of Braille. I think it was my father who somehow discovered the work of Professor Leibniz. He was Dutch, but happened to work at the university nearby. They took me to see him. Leibniz was an enormously tall man, as many Dutch are, with fair, greying hair. He was in good shape for his age, and seemed to me to have been built on a slightly larger scale than other human beings. He spoke with a strong Dutch accent, but in very fluent English. "At the moment I have only a prototype," he said. "It's unclear whether or not my invention will be helpful. You must understand you would be enrolling Dale in a study. I cannot promise anything." "But if it works, he might be able to lead an almost normal life," said my mother. The professor gave a little deprecatory laugh. "That would be the ideal," he said. "It's what we hope for, but it's much too early to tell. Your son is the one who would need to tell us." He pushed the device on the desk in front of him towards us. "If you want, I can begin training this week," he said. "Tomorrow." Leibniz's invention was a small device resembling an electric torch. At the front it had a lens taken from a camera. The only control, aside from the on-off switch at the back, was a spring-loaded sliding switch that enabled the user to narrow the focus of the device all the way down from a 60-degree viewing angle to a laser-sharp focus that could pick out individual punctuation marks on a page. A pair of small lightweight earphones were connected to the device. The purpose of the whole thing was to turn images into a sonic representation, that is, into sound. He called it the sonic eye. When switched on, the device produced a confusing stereo tangle of warbles and bleeps, seeming to reverberate into the far distance. The idea was that my ears were supposed to replace my eyes. At our first lesson, Leibniz said gravely to me, "You must learn to rely only on your ears now. It will take time, a lot of time. Your first task will be to learn to distinguish obstacles that lie in your way." He took me to a gym where traffic cones and sticks had been laid out on the floor in a kind of maze. "Put this on, please," he said, and he handed me a blindfold. When I look back now at my lessons with Professor Leibniz, I marvel at his patience. Hour after hour he spent with me, teaching me to navigate the maze. I believe he had 6 other students of varying ages, although I never met them. He was afraid we might pick up bad habits from each other. Never once did he speak an unkind word to me, nor did he even ever raise his voice. Not even when I once grew frustrated and threw the device to the floor, fracturing its casing. At the time, I never realised that I was his star pupil. Perhaps I had inherited musical genes from my parents. Later I discovered that while all his other pupils seemed to prove his device a failure, I alone mastered the maze and began to be able to discern the shapes of many ordinary objects, and even, after several years of effort, some rudimentary facial expressions. and the shapes of written words. In spite of my occasional fits of bitter frustration as my eyesight steadily declined, I grew to love the eye and became fascinated with it. After some initial lessons, I was allowed to take it home with me, and I delighted in listening intently to the curious sounds it made as I focused on one object after another. By the time I was 14 years old, I was completely blind. I couldn't even tell day from night. My failing sight had only spurred me to greater heights with the sonic eye, and I achieved things with it that even Professor Leibniz had thought impossible. I could tell when a plane was crossing the sky. I could spot pigeons sitting on fence posts. I could distinguish a motorbike from a bicycle, a ripe orange from an unripe orange, a red traffic light from a green traffic light, a 10-pence coin from a 2-pence coin, all by their sounds alone, as created by the sonic eye. I could tell if a fly landed on a potato that I was about to eat, as I proudly proved to my astonished parents. My ability to visualize my surroundings was certainly not as good as that of the sighted, but it was more than sufficient to live an independent life. By the time I was 23 years old, I lived alone and worked as a session musician, mainly playing electric guitar. I relied completely on the sonic eye. Indeed, I had failed to develop many of the skills that the blind often develop, such as the knack of walking with a white stick or using screen readers fluently. I simply hadn't needed those things. And yet, Professor Leibniz was never able to teach anything beyond the most rudimentary uses of his device to anyone else. Indeed, he was never able to learn to use it well himself. Some combination of my musical ear, my childish enthusiasm, and my desperation as my eyesight had steadily failed me had led me alone to truly master the device. What others found an unbearable cacophony of noise emitted by the machine's earphones, I found full of rich meaning and even beauty. I won't say that life was easy. My philosophy is this: life is meant to be an absolute train wreck, and you have to take from it whatever you can. Professor Leibniz died when I was 26. He had a stroke, and after that, he went downhill pretty quickly. I felt almost like I'd lost my father. My actual father was living with my mother in France at the time, and I think I missed Leibniz even more than I missed him. That arrangement was meant to be temporary. My parents were intending to return to England after a kind of long sabbatical. I didn't know that I would never see them again either. I had reached the age of 27 and was doing reasonably well for myself when the virus was first discovered. I took a particular interest in such things on account of my situation. It began in Siberia. An epidemic of blindness occurred among people living in the far north. Baffled scientists searched desperately for an explanation. People lost their sight completely, with entire villages becoming blind over the course of a single day. Eventually it was realized that all the people suffering loss of sight were infected with a virus, and it was hypothesized that the virus rendered the eyes vulnerable to some common environmental factor, perhaps another virus, or ultraviolet light, or even some common substance found in food. Once infected, it was apparently only a matter of time before the eyes of those who had fallen prey to the disease failed completely, and the eyes of large numbers of people would fail all at the same time in response to the unknown environmental trigger. What was particularly frightening was that the virus itself was symptomless, aside from its effects on the eyes. Only a week later, the news broke that large numbers of people around the world were already carrying the virus. You might expect that this would have provoked uproar, but instead it only caused people to question the scientists' initial findings. If so many people were infected, the virus could surely not be the real cause of the blindness. And then, the 28th of August 2031, arrived. I doubt whether the tests for the virus that the scientists had developed were really accurate. If they were, then the virus must have spread rapidly in the intervening months, and I can only think that governments suppressed this information for fear of causing a panic. The 27th of August was an unusually hot day throughout the Northern Hemisphere, and that may have been the precipitating factor. We will never know for sure. When I awoke on the morning of the 28th, I immediately knew something had happened. Strange sounds of moaning and wailing reached my ears. I scanned the street below my bedroom window with the sonic eye and noticed a handful of people stumbling about oddly. Further down the street, it seemed as though 3 or 4 cars had crashed into each other. The electricity seemed to be off and my phone didn't appear to work. I couldn't get a phone signal. I fished an old radio out of the cupboard, found batteries for it and switched it on. Instead of the usual plethora of radio stations, I found only interference. It was pure good fortune that the radio was old enough to have an AM switch on it. Scanning the AM band, I came across an indistinct voice, almost screaming in French. I didn't know much French, but it sounded like he was screaming about his eyes and not being able to see. I was scared naturally, but I had no idea what I ought to do, and I decided to wait and hope everything came back on. I dressed, took a shower with the remainder of the hot water, and ate breakfast. I wondered how long the water could stay hot in the boiler when the power went out. My guess was a matter of hours. If that was correct, the electricity must have gone off in the last few hours. Periodically, the sound of distant explosions reached my ears. Now I think those were mostly the sounds of planes falling out of the sky. At the time I wondered vaguely if war had broken out, but I didn't give the idea serious credence. At one point there was an unnerving banging and shouting at my door, but I ignored it. Whoever it was, he sounded like he was off his head. By the time the evening rolled around, the moaning and screaming had only worsened. People have since asked me why I didn't try to go outside and figure out what was happening. Try imagining you can only see through an old camera with poor resolution that you hold in your hand, and you'll surely understand my problem. I was scared and painfully aware of my vulnerability. I spent the night going half out of my mind with fear. Outside I heard screams, explosions, crashes, cries for help, and I had no idea what was going on. I never properly connected what was happening with the news about the virus. I just thought the French guy on the radio was a madman. If anything, I was becoming increasingly convinced that Britain had been attacked. The next morning I resolved to go outside and find out for myself what was happening. I couldn't stand not knowing any longer. I got dressed, put my shoes on, and opened the door. There I stood for a while, listening and scanning the environment with the sonic eye. I had always kept myself to myself, and I didn't really know anyone else on the street. I was bad at recognizing people and reading facial expressions, and that didn't help. Probably they were scared I'd ask them for help if they got to know me. My few friends were all musical people, and I had no way of contacting them. As far as I could tell, the environment was safe enough, and I began to make my way down the street. Several cars seemed to have veered off the road on my street alone, including the 4 that had somehow collided with each other. From the houses I heard the sounds of bitter arguments and wailing. I wanted to knock on a door and ask what they were wailing about, but I didn't dare. I headed towards the centre of town. Everywhere I encountered the same weird things. No one on the streets, crashed cars, people shouting at each other in the houses. On Church Street I came across a woman, 30 years old for a guess, although my perception of age isn't too keen, shuffling slowly along down the side of the road. She seemed to be feeling her way along the walls of buildings there and the glass fronts of empty shops, as though afraid of losing her balance. She heard my footsteps and called out to me, "Who's there? Is someone there?" I was so disturbed that I almost didn't answer, but it dawned on me that of course she must be blind. As if to confirm, she said, please help me, I can't see." "What's going on out here?" I said. "Oh, thank God," she said. "Please help me. I was walking home and I went blind. I've been out here all night. No one will help me." "Where's your home?" I asked. She told me the address and begged me again to help. It wasn't far away. I took her arm and gently began to guide her down the street. "Can you call me an ambulance?" she asked tremulously. "Something's wrong with my eyes." "My phone doesn't work," I said. "It hasn't worked since yesterday. Do you know what's going on?" "What do you mean?" she said. I explained about the electricity going off, about the car crashes, the explosions and the wailing. I could tell I was scaring her. She didn't know anything about it. She had heard a lot of strange noises, but she'd been so frightened that all she had thought about was getting home or finding medical attention. She was half out of her mind with fear. We soon arrived at her house, and she pounded on the door, shouting for someone called Rob. There was a clattering and shouts coming from somewhere within the house, and the door opened and a man stood there. There was another figure somewhere behind him, but I couldn't make him out. "Rob, is that you?" said the woman. "I've gone blind, Rob. I need a doctor." "Everyone's gone blind," said the man. "Everyone's gone blind, Jenna. The whole world." "Oh my God," cried the woman. "What do you mean? It can't be." The figure in the background came forward. I don't know who he was, but they all seemed to be part of a family. Perhaps he was the brother of the first man. "It's true, Jenna," he said. "Who's with you?" said the first man suddenly. "He guided me home," said the woman. "He can see. Not everyone can be blind, Rob." "I am blind," I said. "I've been blind since I was 14. "Then how could you guide her home?" said the man. "I use a device," I said. "I can get around with it." "What kind of device?" said the man. He seemed actually angry, as though he held me personally responsible for everyone being blind, or as though he suspected me somehow of scamming them. I considered simply leaving them to it, but I wanted answers, and I thought they might know something. "It's here in my hand," I said, and he felt for my arm and then slid his hand down till it contacted the device, which he took hold of. "Give it to me," he said. "We need it." "I can't see without it," I said. "Neither can we," he said. "I'm taking it. Dave, help me." The other man stumbled forward, and I found myself in a hideous wrestling match, the two men trying to pull the sonic eye from my hand while I tried to get it away from them. Somehow they succeeded in wrenching it from me, and I heard it fall to the floor. The earphones pulled themselves out of my ears. They quickly realised I'd dropped it. "Hold him, Dave," said the man, and I had the sense that he was feeling around on the floor for it, while Dave attempted to prevent me interfering. The woman seemed to have retreated into the house, where she was sobbing helplessly. I was in a terrible panic. Just from their voices, it sounded to me like these men were strongly built, and there were two of them and one of me. But there was at least one thing in my favour. I was used to not being able to see, and they weren't. I managed somehow to grab the sonic eye before they could find it, and I gave Dave an almighty push. I retreated down a garden path in the direction of the street pretty sharply, plugging the earphones back into my ears with trembling hands. Fortunately, it wasn't damaged. Professor Leibniz had built it to be robust, and I had already dropped it many times myself without incident. "You come back here," shouted the man, stumbling towards me. "Tell me what's happening," I shouted back to him, from a safe distance. "Everyone's gone blind, that's what's happening," he said. His voice changed to a conciliatory tone. "Look, we need your help," he said. "We've got food. You can stay here." "Good luck," I said, and I walked away. He hurled everything from pleas to threats to outright abuse after me. As soon as I could, I sat down on a bench, shaking horribly, and tried to gather my thoughts. That's when I first began to think seriously about the virus that had spread in Siberia. The only other possibility I could come up with was that a nuclear war had broken out and people were blinded by the explosions. But then surely there would have been more devastation. I would have heard the bombs going off. And although I'd heard a lot of explosions in the past 24 hours, few of them had even managed to rattle my windows. Once I'd mentally regrouped a bit, I decided to return to my house. On the way back, I heard an enormous explosion very close by and preceded by a kind of long descending roar. It sounded like a plane had come down on the edge of town, a big one. I shuddered to think how close I had come to being incinerated. I wondered if there had been any survivors. It didn't sound like there could be. I passed a few more people begging pitifully for help, and I ignored them. After my experience with the woman, I was scared of them. I wasn't going to risk my neck for them. I hoped they found their way home. Back at my house, I tried to gather my thoughts. I was still having trouble really understanding or believing the scale of the problem. I still hoped it might all blow over. But what if it didn't? It struck me that I was frightfully dependent on my sonic eye. At that time, I had no spare. My spare had broken a few weeks earlier, and I hadn't yet had it repaired. I cursed myself inwardly for not having sorted it out. I'd contacted my repair guy about it, but I hadn't actually taken it in for repair yet. Then an idea occurred to me. My repair guy was named Jerry, and he ran a small electronics shop on the other side of town. He had known Professor Leibniz, and he understood how the sonic eyes worked. I had always gone to him to get my eyes repaired. If I could find him, I thought maybe he could tell me how to repair the spare, and in return I could help him. If he was blind too, he'd be in need of help. I decided to make myself a cup of tea before attempting the journey. Then I remembered I had no electricity. Instead, I took a bottle of wine from the fridge, which was beginning to smell, and drank about a third of it. Then I set off. In the centre of town, I began to encounter chaos on a whole new scale. Everywhere there were smashed cars, people moaning piteously, screaming, crying. Numerous buildings were on fire, and the air was frequently thick with smoke. I told myself I'd come back and help as many people as possible once I'd got a spare eye. But in the back of my mind, I knew I probably wasn't coming back. By the time the spare was fixed, if it could be fixed, most of them would probably be dead anyway. The phrase, "the blind leading the blind," came to my mind, and I laughed out loud at it. Then I thought of my parents in France, who must surely either be dead or would be dead soon, and I began to cry. What could I do? I couldn't contact them. I couldn't get to France. There was nothing I could do. Perhaps at best I could save a few people in the town from swift starvation. And then what? Who ever heard of a blind farmer? Our only hope was that the entire world wasn't affected, and that someone, somewhere, would organise a rescue operation. As I approached the town centre, I sensed my environment was becoming increasingly dangerous. Large numbers of people were wandering around, shouting, some of them having lost their minds completely, and others shouting angrily at the sky, at God, at every little sound. Half of the town centre seemed to be in flames. There were dead or dying bodies lying everywhere. some charred by fire and others hanging half out of wrecked cars. I took a long detour to avoid the market square. I didn't want to see what it was like in the absolute centre. Eventually I found the electronics shop. The door was open. There was no sign of Jerry. Of course there wasn't, I thought to myself. Why would he still be in his shop? He didn't live in the shop. But where did he live? I had no idea. I set to work trying to find something that might have his address on it. I found my way into a back room. It was full of tables with bits of electronic equipment on them. Suddenly a voice said, "Dale?" "Jerry?" I said. He was there, sitting in an armchair, with a can of beer in one hand and a half-smoked roll-up of some sort in the other. He began to laugh, quietly at first, then slowly gathering pace, until I too began to laugh with him. "What's so funny?" I said. "I knew you'd come," he said. "I'm just relieved, man. It's just relief." "Can you see me?" I said. "No," he said. "I can't see a ruddy thing." "How did you know I'd come here?" I said. He fell into another fit of hysterical laughter. "I'm sorry," he said. "But who else would visit an electronics shop at the start of an apocalypse?" "Fair point," I said. "Listen, man, sit down," he said, waving at a chair that wasn't there. But I found a chair and sat down anyway. "We've got work to do," he said. "We need to move quickly before everyone dies of thirst and starvation. First, we need to repair your eye. You did bring it, right? The spare?" "I brought it," I said. "Can you repair it?" "I couldn't even oil a squeaking door right now," he said, "but I reckon you can, with my help. Then we're going to make more of them. 5 ought to be enough to start with. Then we'll go to that big old hall down the main road. We'll take it over and we'll start teaching people how to use these things. It's far enough out of the town to be safe and close enough that we can raid the shops." "Jerry, I'm the only person who's ever been able to use these things properly," I said. "Yeah, that was before everyone went blind," said Jerry. "Let me tell you something, Dale. In a few weeks, half the people will be dead. The ones who are still alive in a month or 2 months, they'll be the smartest, most adaptable people. Some of them are going to have whatever it takes to learn how to use these eyes. Maybe not as well as you, but they'll get some mileage out of them at least. Our job's going to be to find the right people and train them." "What then?" I said. "The food will run out. We'll starve. Our best chance is to make contact with people who can still see and persuade them to rescue us." He shook his head. "There are no such people," he said. "The first thing I did was start scanning the airwaves. There's no one. I mean, there are isolated people here and there, and probably there are remote, uncontacted tribes who weren't affected, but no one's coming to help us." I sat there quietly, digesting the idea. Could there be people who simply couldn't transmit radio signals? People who could see but couldn't tell anyone? But then Jerry was right. If we couldn't contact them, and they couldn't even manage to use radio transmitters, they weren't going to be any help to us. "Children," he said. "What?" I said. "Maybe children who are born now won't be affected. Maybe they'll be able to see. And if not, maybe the blindness isn't permanent. Just because a bunch of Siberians didn't get better in the space of a few months doesn't mean everyone else definitely won't, eventually." "A year or 2 and we'll starve to death," I said. "No, we won't," he said. "Think about it, man. Look, the fact is most people aren't going to make it. The food we've got, it's not going to have to feed all that many mouths. I hate to say it, but it's true. You know, there's stuff in the supermarkets that'll last 10 years. We've got 10 years to figure out how to survive." "You seem in surprisingly good spirits," I said, wonderingly. "Hey, I didn't like life all that much before this happened, and I still don't like it now," he said. "So nothing's changed, except I no longer have to open the shop." Then he began to laugh again. Over the following week, he taught me how to systematically examine the broken sonic eye, and eventually we located the fault. The whole business was ridiculous. Two blind men trying to fix complicated optics and electronics. But we developed a kind of gallows humour about it, and eventually we succeeded. I found plenty of food in nearby shops. I had to bring in all our water in bottles, but the shops had plenty of it. After that, Jerry insisted we had to get out of town. First I gathered all the parts he said we'd need, raiding camera shops and hardware stores, and collecting parts from his own shop. We found an abandoned car with the keys still in the ignition, and we began to load everything into it. Jerry's idea was that he would drive, and I'd tell him which way to go. Every day and night, we heard terrible sounds of wailing and screaming. I wanted to help them, but I did nothing. Partly I did nothing because of being conscious of the precariousness of my own situation. Also, Jerry convinced me to focus on the future. That was the way to save the greatest number of people possible, he said, and he was very insistent that I should do nothing to derail our plan, or rather, his plan. Now that I look back on it, I think Jerry was some kind of benevolent psychopath. He just wasn't very affected by other people's suffering. Yet somehow, in the context, that made a kind of sense. Soon the time came to relocate to the hall, a move which I questioned the necessity of, but which again Jerry was very insistent about. We drove there at about 10 miles an hour, Jerry at the wheel. Somehow we managed to arrive in one piece, and when I got a good look at the place, I began to see why Jerry had been so keen on it. It had extensive gardens where we might be able to grow things, and behind it was a stream, which might prove a useful source of water. On the other side of the stream was a field of potatoes, which we thought we might be able to make use of. In the hall itself we found an elderly couple, the owners of the place, incredibly still alive and quite blind. At first they were worried that we had come to harm them or eat up their dwindling food supply. But when they fully understood the situation, the old man stopped waving a shotgun at us and became quite friendly. His name was Bill and his wife was called Jane. They had been running the place as a conference centre, and their staff had all gone home for the night when their eyesight had started to fail. They had expected help to arrive, and when no help had come, they had figured their time on Earth was almost up and had cracked open a few bottles and tried to make the best of the situation. When we explained our plans to them, they were happy to lend us their hall, especially since we could really make their lives a lot easier. Over the following 3 years, Jerry and I built more than 30 sonic eyes. It was slow going at first, but eventually we had something almost resembling an assembly line going, although I had to do most of the physical work. After 2 months had passed, the only people who were still alive in the town were people who developed some kind of system for acquiring food and finding their way around. Some of those people were absolute brutes, hard, ruthless types who were good at surviving, but you wouldn't want to be around them unless you really had to be. We left those people alone. Others were more civilized and had evaded death via cunning and careful planning. We recruited 30 of those people, and I tried to train them in using the sonic eyes we were building. It was hard going. My guess is that there were maybe 1,000 survivors in the town as a whole. They must have all known they were living on borrowed time. Once the shops ran empty, they were doomed. I'm telling you, Jerry used to say, when the food runs out, we're going to have a lot of cannibals on our hands. Our biggest hope was that people would start having children, and the children would be able to see. Even a bunch of 5-year-olds could have helped us try to grow potatoes. Most of the potato plants in the field behind us died from frost, but some plants persisted somehow. They just needed tending. And yet, no children were born, and no one wanted to try to make babies. We had plenty of young couples, but they were all too worried about the future that their children would be born into. You know what the problem is, don't you? Jerry said to me. We've collected a bunch of ruddy intellectuals. They're all people who would rather turn themselves into monks and nuns than take a risk. We should be collecting the brutes, impulsive people with no self-restraint. They're people, Jerry, I said, not cattle. Give them some time. Time is something we're going to run out of pretty bloody soon, said Jerry. He was right. We were having to go further and further to raid shops. Most of what we ate was canned or dried, and much of it was way past its best. At least the rivers were full of fish, but I'm no fisherman, and I couldn't catch enough to feed 30 people. And then, one day, everything changed. Among us was a girl called Rachel. She was only 20, the second youngest among all of us. I walked into the big dining hall one day to find her staring out of the window. "Are you all right?" I said. At first she didn't speak, and after I repeated the question, I realized she was crying. "I can see light," she said. "I can see the sunlight." I tried a few simple tests on her, and there was no doubt about it. She could distinguish light from dark, and she could follow the direction of the shadow of my hand as I moved it between her eyes and the morning sun. Her eyes were recovering. The first thing I did once I was sure about it was to run to find my dear friend Jerry. I found him in his room, hanging by his neck. He left no note. "You idiot, Jerry. If only you'd waited one more day." Now that I look back on it, I think that was his plan all along. He was only sticking around until I had mastered enough electronics to build my own eyes. That day marked the start of the recovery. It took another 3 years, and we barely made it, but everyone regained some degree of vision. 2 years after Jerry's death and the start of Rachel's recovery, a baby was born. Her parents christened her Chiara, from the Italian word for clear. Her eyes were normal. Thank you for listening. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. All the stories on this channel are written by me, John Purcell. If you enjoyed this story, please devote the rest of your life to investigating strange Siberian viruses while blindfolded. Thank you so much. Also, if you would consider clicking the like and subscribe buttons, that would be very much appreciated. Next week I have a story for you about a man who has half of his brain replaced with electronics. Do join me again next Monday for that, and until then, have a good week and sleep well.